So in Screencast 3, we're going to look at some of the trends and issues that are affecting sports facility management. Now, as with Screencast 2, this is a complex area and there are lots of trends and issues in sports facility management that are affecting sports facilities. But I want to focus down in this screencast on those factors that I think are probably most relevant to the scenario which you may have to do a presentation on as part of your assessment for this module. And the facility management scenario is focused on an issue relating to car parking at Ponds Forge. Now, in the live online session and in the seminars this week, you're going to focus much more on the scenario task. But I just want to kind of plant some seeds in your minds about the context for some of the decisions that you might be able to make in that scenario, and the constraints that might be acting on you and how that might limit some of the options available to you and how you might deal with and address the problems. Okay, so the issues I want to consider are, and we mentioned it briefly in the previous screencast, the effect of government austerity on sport facility management. I want to talk to you about what austerity is, how long it lasted for, and the impact it had on sport facility management, and particularly the impact it's had on sports facilities that are provided by local councils. And as we've seen, I've made the case in the previous screencast that really, if we think about sport development, physical activity, and sport participation in general, then to my mind, local government is still the key provider. Might not be as significant economically. If we look at the economic value of voluntary work, that too is bigger than the value of the public sector. But in terms of having a central place in providing the facility infrastructure that enables people to participate informally, individually, or as part of a club, the evidence there is quite strong to me that local government is still the most important facility provider that there is out there in terms of scope and range and size and general take up by the whole population. So I want to look at the effect of austerity on public sector sports facilities. I then also want to consider, only very briefly, because we've only got time to do it very briefly, the increased competition for customers for sports facilities, and the pressures that is putting on sports facility managers. And this then number two, should logically lead us to a discussion of the importance of maintaining throughput and managing customer experience across all facility providers. Now, throughput in facility management terms means visitor numbers. Yeah, so the importance of holding the visitors and managing customer experience is really important when we look at the level of increased competition for customers for sports facilities. If you want to maintain your visits and you want to maintain your revenue, you've got to actually increase or provide a reasonable customer experience for your users. So, what is austerity? There has been an awful lot written about austerity, some of it quite political as well. So I've tended to steer away from videos on YouTube to show you this, or newspaper articles, because newspaper articles either tend to take the view that austerity is all bad regardless, or take the opposite view that austerity was a necessary evil, and that it was necessary for the economy of the UK to undertake it. But anyway, so I'm going to give you a very simple kind of definition here. So austerity is a political and economic policy which is aimed at reducing public spending in order to avoid running up debt. So, in other words, austerity is a shorthand for cuts in public spending. And the reason for this is back in 2010, a Conservative government was elected, and the Conservative government, and in particular the Chancellor at the time, George Osborne, he was of the view that the UK government was spending more money on public services than it was generating in taxation, and that there was a deficit. In other words, the government was spending more money than it had money coming in, and that was creating a deficit. And in his view, and in the view of the Conservative government at the time, the deficit was too high, much too high. And the danger was that if we carried on running up a deficit, that would build up into a huge debt, which would need to either be paid at some stage in the future by future generations, and it would impact on their lives, and that B, in really extreme situations, funding organisations or financial institutions which fund government and lend them money to spend would look and say, well, you're running on empty here, UK economy, we're not prepared to fund you anymore, and that could lead to a catastrophic turning off of the taps. So, whatever the kind of political view on this, austerity has been a reality. Really, from 2010 to 2019, the UK government followed a policy of austerity, and it's important to realise that local councils are largely funded in the form of grants, block grants from central government to local councils. And one of the main victims, or one of the key victims, or one of the key places that the cuts in public spending fell was in the area of local authorities. And as I've intimated in the previous screencast, because sports facilities in the public sector have not relied on making a profit, because they've been about generating equal access and encouraging participation amongst those who are from less well-off backgrounds, then we look at the Mintel evidence. There's some evidence that that's been a reasonably successful strategy over the years. But they've required subsidy to actually be able to do this. They've required heavily on public spending. So they're not making enough money to cover their running costs. So they are a subsidised service. Okay. So, local councils, and therefore the government, when they fund local councils, have in effect been spending money on sports facilities because they're not generating a profit. They need funding, they need investment. In the same way as governments invest in education, clearly schools do not make a profit on their own operations. We hope that having an educated population leads to people who can be employed well, generate high levels of income, which in turn generate high levels of tax revenue for the government to spend. And similarly for sports facilities, the rationale is that, if we have a healthier workforce, it will be more productive, take less days off sick. There will be less call on the NHS if we lead healthier lives, of which being active is an important part, and so on. So government invests in sport and physical activity, but it's an investment that doesn't make any money directly back from it. It's a rather indirect return. So it's a social return on investment in savings in other areas of spending, such as health, crime, education, and so on. Okay, so austerity essentially has meant that local councils have had their budgets cut. So I want to look in the following slides at what the level of cuts have been and what impact has this had on the way that facilities are managed. Okay, now, to put these figures together, I've looked at what are called the local authority revenue and expenditure accounts. Okay, there's a hyperlink to this here. These are big detailed spreadsheets, and I don't expect you to actually go and look at these and be able to find the relevant information. So I've put this slide together here to try to show. And what this shows is that in 2010, at the beginning of austerity, local authority net current expenditure on all services, so this is the amount of money which local authorities spent on services, was £122 billion. Okay, so this is figures in billions. So local authority spends, annually in 2010-11, all local authorities, there are 354 in England, spent 122.4 billion. So these are figures for England. What we can see is some fairly steep cuts initially, and that, by the time we got to 2017 to 18, there'd been a kind of cut of around, of £11 billion in terms of local authority overall spending. Okay, this has recovered to a degree to £114 billion in 2019-20. You need to remember as well that these figures do not take into account inflation. So £122 billion in 2010-2011, if we applied inflation and increased costs, would probably be more like, I don't know, I'm guessing now, I haven't done the maths, I haven't looked up the calculations, would be, I'm guessing, more like £130 billion plus. So the difference between where we were in 2010, which would be in today's money, let's say £130 billion, and where we are now, is that local councils are around, let's say, 15-16 billion pounds a year worse off than they would have been if funding levels had continued as they were in 2010 at the beginning of the austerity period. So what we've seen between 2010-11 and 2019-20 is a 6.8% drop in local authority budgets, okay, the amount that local authorities spend on services. Now, one of the things that we did talk about when we talked about the characteristic of public sector sports facilities is that, and public sector sports services in general, is that they are non-statutory, discretionary. And what we said at the time in Screencast 2 was that if they are non-discretionary, if they are discretionary, they are provided at the local authority's discretion or choice, and they're non-statutory. There's no legal obligation to provide sports facilities. We said that they would be subject to, or more subject to, cuts and deprioritisation in times when budgets were under pressure. So we've seen in austerity, one slide, that local authority spending has been under pressure, and there's been a 6.8% drop. If we applied inflation to that figure, the drop would probably be much bigger and probably greater than 10%. So, what effect has that reduction in total local authority expenditure had on local authority expenditure on sport and recreation? And what we can see here is that, the non-statutory discretionary nature of local authority sport has led it very exposed to quite severe cuts in the amount of money that local authorities can spend on sport. So here we see that at the dawn of austerity, local authority sport had net expenditure of around 863 million, or 0.8 billion pounds. Okay, so 863 million. Now, if you look at a lot of textbooks that are around and that were written at the end of the 1990s and at the turn of the millennium in the 2000s, this figure was more like £1 billion. So it has been decreasing, and there is a long-term decrease. But the steepness of this decrease has been particularly steep during this austerity period. And another thing that's interesting to note is that if we look at the previous slide, we can see from 2017 to 18 a slight upturn in net expenditure in local government across all services. But if we look at 2017 to 18 to 2019-20 on local authority sport, we can see that expenditure is still declining, and declining quite steeply. So this means really a very, very, very significant drop in local authority sport budgets between 2010-11 and 2019-20, a 60% drop, which is really significant. And just a story from my previous employer. I used to work for an organisation within Sheffield City Council called Activity Sheffield. I left there in 2004, and when I left in 2004, Activity Sheffield, which was the kind of community recreation, sport development, outreach, physical activity department of the City Council, probably had about 70 or 80 employees overall, working all across the city. My understanding now is that Activity Sheffield has 1 or 2 employees left. So that service has been kind of taken apart, really. A lot of its services are outsourced and commissioned through other organisations, but Sheffield City Council has probably had more spending cuts than many other local authorities. So I would expect, I don't have the figures, I could look at the figures if I wanted to in detail, looking at the local authority revenue account data, but I would expect in a city like Sheffield that the cuts have been greater than 60%. So we've established that there have been huge cuts nationally in the amount of money that's available to spend on local authority facilities and local authority sports services in general, but sports facilities take the vast majority, the lion's shares of that spending. So what we've established is that subsidies for sports facilities are under pressure, therefore. So the days of massive subsidies for sports facilities where they could run at a loss and the local authority would have the budget to be able to pay and make up the difference in what it costs to run the facility and the income that they took, those days are kind of coming towards an end, or they are severely under pressure. Now, what response can local authorities make to this, and can facility managers make? Well, response one is the kind of, if you like, the nuclear button response, and that is to start closing facilities. And it's easy to see that that would have a fairly catastrophic effect on sports participation, sport development work, physical activity work, because we've seen the central role that public sector provision has in terms of sports participation and in terms of voluntary sector hiring and the ability for them to actually operate and provide opportunities for their members to take part in sports. So reducing the number of facilities is the nuclear option. And, despite noise in the press, I think you'd find that, even though budgets have been cut by well over half, we haven't seen half of the facilities in a city like Sheffield or any other local authority I know of, to be honest, actually close. They've managed to stay open. So this means that we're probably more likely to have seen response two. And response two is that you increase your revenue, and revenue is income, by acting more commercially, whilst also trying to reduce costs. Now, in this lecture and in this module, we don't have time to go into the economics of sports facility management, but the leisure centres that we have, they have what's called very high fixed running costs, which means it's very, very difficult to actually reduce costs. So the only way that we can reduce subsidies in public sector sports facilities, or the most effective way of reducing subsidies in sports facilities, is to try to increase revenue. Yeah, you can either increase the money you take in or reduce the money that you spend. It's very difficult to reduce the money that you spend in facility management. So therefore, you need to try to generate more income by attracting more customers and by attracting more high-paying customers. And there are other things as well, like local authorities can try to become more efficient and sell more space at more times of the day. But sport is a leisure time activity, and what you find is that you have big periods of off-peak use when there is relatively low demand, and periods of peak demand when there is very high demand, when people are off work outside of normal working hours. And it's actually quite difficult to sell some of that off-peak space. So it is also quite difficult to become more efficient as a sports facility. So what does this mean? It means that in trying to increase revenue and act more commercially, this can cause something of a clash with sport development and physical activity programs in sports facilities, because quite often these are not as lucrative and don't generate as much revenue as other types of programming. And one source of income, which is important, not as important as admissions revenue in public sector sports facilities, but is still a contribution to overall income, is the amount of money that customers, visitors spend on catering and vending machines while they're in facilities. Many people on sport development and physical activity programs are from low income groups, almost by definition. And this means they're far less likely to be able also to not just pay higher prices, but also contribute to what's called secondary income, i.e. income which isn't generated from the direct cost of paying to play the sport, but income which is generated by spending money in cafes and food outlets and vending machines within sports facilities. So really the effect of austerity is that it could be seen to be causing a clash between the need to meet business revenue objectives while at the same time trying to meet sporting and physical activity and broader social objectives. Right? Here's some figures just from some kind of independent trade, independent industry bodies. So I think one of the facts is that a decade of austerity has left many facilities short on essential maintenance. And what's clear, and we saw this earlier in the big dip in revenue that across the commercial and the public sector, is that COVID-19 closures have had a further impact on the financial viability of public sector sports facilities. So how serious is this? Well, Swim England, and we've seen how important local authority, and I'm including in this education pools, are in providing sport swimming pools. Swim England expects, if nothing is done about this, the number of pools available to the public to fall by 40% by 2030. Okay, and they've called for the government to invest £500 million to ensure the continued availability of pools. I would say that £500 million is an extremely conservative estimate and might keep things moving in the short term, but will not in the long term. And Community Leisure UK, which is a kind of umbrella organisation for sport providers, and UK Active have put the cost of saving sports facilities from closing at over £800 million. That's more realistic, but I would still say myself that sounds on the conservative end of things. So we're talking about substantial investment, and this is because local government has been short of money to actually spend on the maintenance and investment in facilities. And one of the issues in facilities is as facilities become older and become less attractive, they're less likely to attract customers, paying customers to generate revenue. so they're likely to require higher and higher subsidies. We can see that local authority budgets have been squeezed, so they are less able to afford subsidies to keep these facilities open. So the kind of disaster scenario is we carry on down this road and facilities end up closed. So that really is the effect of austerity on facility management, and I'll show you here more about that throughout this year and future years. We're supposedly coming out of a period of austerity, but there's also a great deal of economic uncertainty as we come out of the coronavirus lockdown and recovery, and the effect that Brexit may have on the economy. Most economic commentators suggest that the UK economy will continue to stagnate and will only have very, very slow rates of growth. So, the economic conditions don't look favourable to increase spending on public sports facilities unless there's a significant change in policy. So we've talked about the impact of austerity, and I just want to very briefly, and we'll look at these points more briefly, talk about other issues. So austerity has meant that local authorities are having to act more commercially, and revenues they're trying to increase revenues. And I think the evidence is, given that sports facilities haven't yet closed despite a decade of austerity, that facilities have been successful in generating more revenue and that subsidies have become smaller and less frequent. Now, what this has meant is that one of the issues that this has led to is that facilities are competing against each other far more fiercely. And particularly because gyms are an important source of revenue for public sector facilities, because there's membership schemes that can be sold there, which generate high levels of income. That facility providers in the public sector are having to compete more and more against a growing private sector. And we saw from the Mintel report back in Screencast 2 that the size of the commercial sector in physical activity, namely in the form of gyms, has increased significantly. So this has created increased competition. And COVID-19 at the same time, more recently, has closed a lot of facilities, and this has led to a kind of growth in the demand for home-based physical activity and exercise, and also more informal non-facility based sport and physical activity exercise. So we see increased use of online exercise classes at home, and cycling equipment, as an example, saw quite a significant growth during the period of lockdown as people bought more bikes to try and do more cycling activity. So that might be a shift away from kind of built facilities to kind of non-facility based sports, so roads for running, homes, back gardens for exercise activity, and roads for cycling. So there's increased competition in the first point of the slide between different facilities. Yeah, so public sector and commercial sector increasingly fighting over gym memberships, which are an important source of revenue. COVID-19 has forced many people towards non-facility based sport and physical activity. And all the time, the menu which is available to us for our leisure time activities is increasing and growing. So the leisure sector itself has grown over recent years. There are more restaurants, more bars. There's more kind of online streaming leisure which we can do. So the competition for sports facilities has increased and continues to increase significantly. The other thing that has changed is that's creating attrition rates is that sometimes the pool of customers isn't getting any bigger. So we talked earlier on about attrition rates, and attrition rates are the rate at which gym members don't renew their memberships. Okay, and UK evidence suggests that 50% of members do not renew their memberships or leave within 12 months. So again, trying to keep hold of a small number of customers means there's an awful lot of competition between public sector facilities and commercial facilities, right? And both sectors find it difficult to retain members. Okay, now this leads us on to the third and final point I want to make. And the wording of this slide is important in terms of the scenario that you've got for Ponds Forge. So the importance of maintaining throughput and managing customer experience, those final 5 words, throughput and managing customer experience, are taken directly from the scenario for your presentation on facility management. Now, the content of previous slides should indicate that given the pressures on facility management, a focus on customer service is critical to keeping users happy and therefore protecting revenue. Now, as we move towards the online synchronous group session and your small group seminars this week, what we will do is we'll use the scenario for your presentation based on Ponds Forge to focus on issues relating to customer experience in sports facilities. But we'll also look at how the financial situation that facilities find themselves in, and Sheffield City Trust and Ponds Forge are certainly in this situation, means that they cannot solve problems towards issues like car parking by spending money, by throwing money at this. So we're going to have to look at how we manage customer experience and expectations, so that they understand that options need to be framed in what is realistic and achievable and what constraints we're operating under. And we need to look for creative solutions to manage the problem. And we also need to try to understand, in the context of customer experience, how important is car parking as part of the overall experience of visiting a sports facility, and how important is it in the context of Ponds Forge. And in the seminars and online synchronous, we will present you with some information about customer satisfaction data at Ponds Forge and customer satisfaction levels with car parking. We'll ask you to prioritise issues and see what priority you would give to the car parking problem as assistant manager at Ponds Forge. And we'll also look at other evidence around things like mode of travel to Ponds Forge. So what proportion of users travel by public transport, bus or super tram, or walk there, compared to the number of people that travel by car and actually attempt to park in the car park. So we will look at more of those things and discuss those in the seminars next week, or the seminars that follow this pre-recorded session, and they will allow you to interact with staff and discuss your ideas with other students about how you can address the problems in the scenario. So that's the end of the session for this week. Thanks for your attention.